Okay, it's 9 o'clock. Let's get started then. Good morning, everyone. How are you doing today? Today we'll be talking about open source front-end frameworks. There are some non-open source ones, but most of them fortunately do. First of all, a bit about myself. My name is Henry. I work in a company called Henge in Japan as a front-end engineer. Little bit fun fact about me, I like ergonomic keyboards, split keyboards, and I use NeoVim. Okay, let's get started. A bit of a disclaimer, since we're comparing about frameworks, there will be some opinions, but the opinions are my own and not of my employers. Okay, let's get started then. Open source front-end frameworks, there are too many choices for us. There are Angular that came first, we have React, Vue, Svelte, Solid, Quick, Astro. There are way too many of them, and this causes analysis paralysis, like how do we know which one to use for our next projects? Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, I've used these three frameworks in my current company in different projects. I've used Vue for a bit over 4 years. I used Svelte for 1 year, and I was actually the one who architected this project, so I was the one who chose Svelte for this project. And afterwards, I joined another project that uses React, and I've only in this team for less than a year. But I think I now have a good grasp of what is the strengths and weaknesses for each framework. So let's get to it. But before we start, I'd like to do a quick head count for the audience here. How many people have learned or used React in? Okay, quite a lot. How about Vue? Okay, not a lot. How about Svelte? Wow, one person. Okay, kind of as expected. Because everyone, most people knows React. Let me start from React then. First of all, who doesn't know React, right? This is the result of the State of JavaScript 2024 survey. The usage part, React is the blue one, which is over 80% of the respondees actually used React. And second one is actually Vue, and third one is Angular, hovering at around 45%. Svelte would be down here, 23, so not too much. And this is the NPM trends. So the trends of the downloads of these packages on NPM. You can see that React is actually a bit over 5 times downloaded as much as Vue, and Svelte is down there, so that's a very big gap. And that causes a very interesting quote that says no one ever got fired from using React. This is actually somewhat funny because there was a blog post that came after that said somebody almost got fired for using React, but that's for another time. So why is React so successful then? First of all, I need to go back in history and tell a story about the time before React. There was a very popular library called jQuery, and we write jQuery inside HTML file, which we don't really do nowadays in front end. So HTML file, you have a button, you put an ID on the button, usually is the best practice, and then you load a script called jQuery from a CDN, and you load another script block that executes the jQuery. The first line here means that when the DOM is already loaded, so when everything the HTML is ready to be queried, you call this function. This function will try to get an element with the ID of submit, which we have declared down there. Add a click handler, make a HTTP GET request, which at the time we don't really have fetch or Axios. So this abstracts away the XML HTTP request that is very quite complex to get working right. And after we finish the GET request, we can finally use the data that is returned. So this is fine and all, but jQuery is, nowadays we call it a very imperative approach, because we need to let it know exactly step by step what we want it to do. And this is where React actually gets it very interesting, makes it very easy for us front-end engineers to build UI. So first of all, we have the import statement. We can use any of the functions that React has. And we export a component from each file. And this is not an HTML file anymore. It's called a TSX or JSX file. and then you return a template that kind of looks like HTML, but it's not actually HTML, but it feels very close to HTML, that it feels like you can actually write HTML inside JS files. And you refer to some items that you declared previously, so a click handler, a state. And this is how you define a state in React. You first call the useState function, provide it with an initial value. You provide a getter and a setter. And when you make a click handler, you can use the setter to set a new value. And this causes React to re-render this component and display the updated value, the count value there inside the button. Not only that, because JSX is basically writing templates inside JavaScript, you have access to very programmatic way to write templates. You can use like inline if, so if you have a conditional you want to show a UI a certain way, you can use the ternary operator. You can also use like the OR operator. So in the second one here, if the nickname is false, you don't render anything. But if it's true, you render the span inside. So it's very powerful in that way because you can leverage the power of scripting in templating. Another thing that React is popular of is using the unidirectional data flow. So data only flows one way from the parent to the child. Here we have the child component. The child component just renders a simple input, and it receives the data from the parent. And when something is happening to it, when the user types something, it calls the callback that is also provided by the parent. So the parent will be the one here to be responsible for the state. We have the state here to set the data. We have the event handler, and we just pass it into the child. So in this case, like the child cannot actually say to the parent that they want to change something. The child can only call the callback that the parent gives to them. And this is how we use the data after that. Another thing that is also quite popular saying in React is that React is a library, not a framework. And this comes up in framework discussions too, because the other ones are framework, but why is React actually a library? So the reason behind this, according to the React team, is that other than templating and state management, React doesn't really provide much else. And there are a lot more to front-end engineering than just state and templating. But it also, on the other hand, provides flexibility in terms of like the supporting libraries. For example, there is a global state management other than the local one. You might have heard of Redux, MobX, the context API that is native to React. There's also routing, like there are several routing packages available like React Router, 10-stack router, data fetching, you have a lot of different options, styling, even the styling is not set in stone. You can use any styling approach that you like. Also, meta frameworks, you have like Next.js, Gatsby, Remix. So React is all about choice, being non-opinionated, and the community will then come up with libraries to support it. So all this sounds like good stuff. So why do we need to change? Let's just use React forever, right? I disagree with that, and I'll talk a bit more about it. But well, React actually, we can all agree that React revolutionized the way we write front-end code. It's not without its quirks. So first quirk, it's a library, not a framework. And this also came up in the pro section earlier, right? So why is it here again? React is very unopinionated, as I said, to the point of being incomplete. What I mean is that all this, the options that I mentioned earlier, are not provided by React. So the community becomes very fragmented, like people choose different ones that suits their needs. And I think a framework should provide a bit of success as opposed to a bit of failure, which means that it should be easy to go into the correct best practices patterns. Well, I think React is offering the opposite. Like by offering options, it actually unintentionally may lead users to use the bad practices, especially because there is no default provided, right? So you risk using the wrong tool for the job, Like some libraries are better for big projects, some are better for smaller projects. You can overcomplicate your implementation because of this. Also for beginners, it can be really hard to know what is the best practice with React. And this is something that I also experienced myself as a beginner. Like there are too many options. I'm not sure which one should I use. Fragmentation. So no two React projects are the same. Even if your company is using React, if you're not using the same supporting libraries, not all of the knowledge will be transferable. So people would still need to learn new things. Some might argue that being opinionated is a bad thing. Like people like choice, right? But I'd say having an opinion is better than not having any and just let everyone choose whatever they want. I think a default is still very necessary, but then you should also allow people to choose another thing if the default doesn't suit them. And this is where in React, Meta Frameworks came to the rescue. Meta Framework is now recommended by React over just using React to build an app. And it includes a lot of useful supporting features like data fetching, server-side rendering. We have Next.js, which is very popular. We have Remix that's recently merged with React Router. And we also have Stack Query. So these are like the new recommendations to build React apps because they come with the supporting libraries to actually make one that works well and performant. And in React, one of the interesting core functionality is that React defaults to re-rendering everything, even when you might think it doesn't need to re-render. So in React, changes in state, local state, props, or context, which is like a global state, will trigger a re-render for the component, but also for all its descendants. And this is very interesting because React doesn't have a way to tell if the descendants of a component are static or not. It cannot tell, for example, if you have like a component with a static tree and a dynamic tree to only re-render the dynamic tree. It doesn't have that information. So it defaults to actually re-render the entire component again. An example, if you have like a component that continuously loops to read the current time with the get date, like React wouldn't be able to tell that it needs to re-render every second, for example, with a set timeout. So it needs to play safe and re-render everything. And in React, some degree of extra re-renders, which is extra work, is actually tolerated for fear of doing premature optimization. And this causes React apps to, by default, be slower than the alternatives. Optimizing React performance is also a very manual process. You might have heard from, for React users, something that React called memoization. And there are two different functions for memoization, which is React Memo and Use Memo. Sounds very similar, but used very differently. So Use Memo here, for example, is to memoize the result of a calculation or a function, whereas React.memo is actually to memoize the component itself. You also have something called Use Callback, which is to memoize the function declaration. Because React is using a render function, the function declaration will be re-declared every time the component is re-rendered unless you memoize it with the use callback function. And there are also some other hooks that are used to optimize performance. And all of this we have to do manually, and even the core team says that you don't always need to do this. Sometimes extra renders is fine. But extra renders also means you're doing extra work on your client's devices, right? So is there a better way to this? Let's invite the second contender here, Vue. Vue is, they call it a truly reactive compiler-informed virtual DOM. So it also uses virtual DOM similar to React, but it uses what is called a dependency tracking. So in this example, we have a div with with 3 children div. The first 2 is static. It doesn't have to load any dynamic data. The third one uses a state. So it needs to be renewed every time. Vue statically analyze this code and will be able to optimize not re-rendering the other 2 that are static. It can also see what operations needs to be done on elements too. Like for example, the first element there, it only needs to change the class bindings. And the second one is it only need to change the ID and value state. And the third one, it only need to change the inner text. So it can actually optimize for each render, for each part that is necessary. And the third one is tree flattening. So if you have a huge static tree that doesn't have any dynamic data, you don't really need to track it. You just track which one that actually needs to be changed. And that makes it more performant than React. The file format is also a bit different, single file components, almost like writing plain HTML, CSS, file. So you have the script part on top, you have the import, state definition, template, which is actual real HTML instead of JSX that is sort of like HTML but not. And also the style part, which is built into the framework itself. It also uses two-way data binding, which means that you define a state here and you use it here. If you wanted to set state to an input and also read from that input, there is a convenient syntax called vmodel here. So you don't have to do it like in React where you bind to the value and also you bind a change handler to the input. And this is the third contender, Svelte. Svelte is also using a compiler-based architecture, but the difference is that it compiles into vanilla JavaScript. So it reads your code, it knows what you want to do, and it compiles a imperative JavaScript that you don't want to write, but it's actually very performant. So it is done automatically for you. It has a much improved performance because it doesn't need to use the virtual DOM. This is one of the websites that lists benchmarks for frameworks. And you can see here that React is actually pretty slow, and especially in this part. And Svelte is mostly much faster than the competition, at least among these three. Svelte also has a very enjoyable developer experience. Many people who tried it said that it is a very nice experience. They want to keep using it. It has some helpers to help you write very simple code. Like for example, the state and the property in the image is the same. You can just use a shorthand for that. Also here, you can easily use shorthands to conditionally apply classes. So how do they compare then? So Vue and Svelte is actually much more similar than React. So I'll make the comparison like a bit group. First of all, it's a comparison between SFC and JSX. So top left is Vue. It uses something called directives, which looks like attributes to control flow. So if condition, you render this, else if you render that. And the second one is with Svelte. You use what is called something like a handlebar syntax, where you make a dedicated block just to write the conditions. And React, as mentioned earlier, you can just use JavaScript. You can use inline conditions. And these have different implications. React is very powerful because you can actually use JavaScript, any kind of JavaScript. It's not bound to the rules of the framework. You can even define JSX as props. So you can pass the JSX template as prop. You can define multiple components in one component, which makes it very powerful. But it also has some quirks. Because it is running inside JavaScript file, you cannot have the HTML attribute class, because the React compiler, the interpreter won't be able to tell the difference between the JSX class and the JavaScript class syntax. So they have to rename the attribute to be class name. Similar with the for attribute, it will collide with the JavaScript for looping. So they need to rename it to HTML4. It's also easy to write code like this that is quite hard to read. So since also JSX text can appear anywhere, it makes it very hard to read sometimes. You read a prop definition and suddenly JSX text come in. So properly setting up linters in React goes a long way to help the code's maintainability and readability. With Vue, it's using conditions as attributes or directives. So there's a vif, velse if, there's a v for looping. It's very nice, but as your elements, as your components gets bigger and more complex, it can be hard to track, especially if your element is 100 lines long, for example. With Svelte, it's much more verbose. You have like a dedicated blocks for conditionals, but this is actually very predictable. Control flow stands out from the template. The indentation is pretty much enforced when you use a formatter. It makes code reviews very nice because it's very easy to check the logic. The other difference is 2 versus one-way data binding. So one-way data binding is easier to get our head around, but it causes much more boilerplate code, as the example earlier. React needs to get value and set value to the state every time when we bind it to an input, for example. So we have the value prop here and the onChange event there. It also causes an additional re-render because we are setting a value. So React needs to render the input again, even though it just receives the input from the user. And two-way data binding solves this by actually being more concise to write. And the next part is related to the earlier statement about being opinionated and unopinionated. React is very flexible, but you have to make a lot of choice, and choosing the wrong library can actually be costly down the road. Knowledge is not easily transferable when you use different libraries, and both Vue and Svelte are more opinionated. So it's easier for beginners to start. You know what the default is, you can start using it. Some people also prefer this kind of approach. And the suggested libraries are usually, because it is default or suggested, sometimes maintained by themselves. It's likely to be well maintained for a long time, which can't be said for React. And the biggest example of being opinionated and unopinionated is about styling. In React, there are like at least 5 different ways to style your component. And with Vue and Svelte, it is part of the language itself. You just define a style block. And the next one, which is the most important one, I think, is the difference in how you define components. So in React, a component definition is a render function. It runs every time the component is rendered. So if you write a data fetch inside your component definition here, this will actually be, the console log here will actually be rerun every time the component is re-rendered. So you have to opt out of having some codes being rerun every time, for example, by using the use effect hook. And because it cannot statically parse the code, as mentioned earlier. Memoization is also a manual process, so you have to keep in mind how React works and add manual optimizations on it every time. Whereas Vue and Svelte is not defining a render function, it's defining a setup function instead. So everything that you write inside the component definition, for example like this only runs once when the component initializes, so you don't have to opt out of re-rendering. It knows when to re-render based on what state you have changed. So you don't need to write use memo, use callback. Dependency array, like you use in use effect, is also not necessary. And Vue and Svelte was similar, right? So what are the core differences? So one of them is being embeddable. Vue can be embedded in existing web apps. Like you have a legacy app and you want to add some modern functionality to it, you can use Vue, but Svelte cannot be used because it needs a build step. Svelte tooling are more integrated, which is like, for example, the meta framework is built by the core team, and state management is also part of the language itself. Svelte syntax is simpler. Vue has a lot of like similar but slightly different options like ref and reactive watch and watch effect. This can cause a bit of confusion when learning. And Svelte comes by default with a compiler that produces very optimized code, but competitions are nowadays trying to do the similar approach, like React compiler, Vue with vapor mode. So where do each one shine then? With Svelte, I think it's the best performance and bundle size. It is even used in like POS, point of sale devices. It has like enjoyable developer experience that everyone tends to like. Code reviews are easier. It outputs vanilla JavaScript. It's easy to integrate with other libraries. Like in our company, we use like 2 third-party vanilla JavaScript libraries, and we were able to integrate it successfully with the Svelte framework. So you don't have to look for a Svelte-specific version of the library, unlike React, where you usually want to look for the React-specific one for it to work. Yeah, and as mentioned earlier, embedding is not possible. React has a much bigger community, which means that you are likely won't encounter like issues that nobody else have ever found. Most likely when you encounter an issue, you will be able to find people asking about it and solutions. tooling are more mature. It has a much bigger demand. So if looking for a job is one thing, learning React is definitely the better solution now. But for companies, hiring experienced React developer can actually be harder. Performance optimization, as mentioned earlier, is quite complex, and not all production apps gets to that scale. So even people who have used React for some time might not reach the performance optimization experience necessary in some other projects. And React has a very good docs. It has like what is called use effect. Okay, looks like I don't have much time. I'll wrap this up very shortly. Vue is the middle ground. It is continuously evolving, and it has a very good tooling. Its tooling is also being shared for other frameworks to use. So takeaways is that React has revolutionized the way we write front-end code. It's not the first one, but it's the most successful. But is it still the right default in 2025? As I explained earlier, the peers has caught up, surpassed its performance, solved the problems in different ways. And another takeaway is like try out new things, like try these new frameworks that you haven't tried. Keep an open mind. Don't bring the old mindset when you try a new one, and you might end up learning, liking it. And personal projects are a great way to experiment. And a bit about my company. My company is sponsoring my trip here so that I can share knowledge with you. We are a cloud security company in Japan. And if you're interested in on-site full-time or internship position, feel free to scan this QR code. And yeah, that's actually it from me. Thank you. And if you want to connect, feel free to scan this QR code.
Thank you, Henry. We've got time for like 1 or 2 questions. Any questions? I love Vue. I love Svelte. I organize Geek Camp Singapore, so we use Svelte for some of the reactive parts of the static website. So it's really useful. Easy to code, easy to code, because I don't really code.
Easy.
Yeah, very approachable.
Can I answer? Of course. So thanks for the introduction, the overview. How do you compare the 3 frameworks for more advanced kind of setup like server-side rendering, micro frameworks?
That's a good question, because I actually didn't mention much about SSR. I'm trying to fit a lot of content here, but SSR in React is more fragmented. Like there's Next.js, there is Remix, there are several like front-end meta frameworks for React, and each has their own benefits and disadvantages. Some people doesn't really like how React is leaning very closely to Next.js and Vercel, and try to like build React as what Next.js is. Yeah, I can see some people nodding in agreement. The Svelte version of the Meta framework is actually built by the same team, and we actually use that to build a single-page application. So even though it's a Meta framework, you can use it for both SSR and single-page application. It works very well. It comes with the render as you fetch approach by default. It comes with loader functions, so it's very nice to use. Unfortunately, I don't have experience with the Vue version, Nux, but I heard Nux has some very good stuff too. But it's not maintained by the same team. Like there's a separate team that maintains Nux, separate from Vue. Although I heard that they are actually working very closely. Yeah, so I don't think they will differ very much. Yeah.
Did you play with micro frameworks?
I don't think I have. Is it something like Petit Vue or?
No, micro front ends.
Micro front end.
Yeah.
I have not. Yeah, our company's products doesn't get to that scale yet. Yeah. Although micro front end is very interesting if you have like a large scale apps that actually needs to. Thank you. Okay, thank you everyone.